The son called his mother a burden and kicked her out of her own home. He thought she'd disappear forever, but what she did next made him regret it for life. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The early morning sun spilled through the gauzy curtains of the kitchen window, casting a soft glow on the worn linoleum floor that had seen more years than the man who laid it. The kettle whistled in the corner, its sound a familiar comfort in a house where routine had become a kind of ritual, a quiet hymn of survival. Marilyn Wright, known to most simply as Marilyn, poured herself a modest cup of tea, hands shaken just slightly, not from weakness but from years. Her fingers bore the signs of labor, roughened pads, faint scars, and the delicate tremble of a woman who had spent a lifetime giving everything and keeping nothing for herself. She moved slowly, not out of frailty, but out of deliberation. Her home was modest, a single-story bungalow she had paid off one paycheck at a time. First as a laundress, then a cleaner, and later as a live-in nanny for a woman who refused to say her name. Everything in that house had passed through Marilyn's hands. The floral curtains, sewn by her on a machine bought second-hand. The chipped oak dining table, carried in with the help of a neighbor she'd fed during a hard winter. The framed photo of her son David on the wall, wearing his law school graduation robe with a smile too polished to be real. Paid for by a pawned engagement ring she hadn't worn since the day her husband Thomas was buried. David had been her reason, her mission, her every sunrise and storm. After Thomas passed, pancreatic cancer, swift and ruthless, Marilyn had taken her grief and folded it into quiet action. She'd worked every job offered, skipped every meal she could afford to miss, just to make sure her son never went without. There were nights she cried into a cold pillow, afraid he'd one day resent her for not being enough. But he never did. Not until he married Jessica. Jessica Lawrence was everything Marilyn wasn't. Light-skinned, sharp-tongued, perfectly educated, and raised in a home with a tennis court in the backyard. From the very first handshake, Marilyn had known the woman saw her as a burden, not a mother-in-law. There was politeness, yes, too much of it. Every ma'am was laced with a condescension so subtle it took Marilyn weeks to recognize it for what it was. Disdain dressed as courtesy. David, caught between the two women, tried to play the peacemaker, but he always tilted toward Jessica. Always. Still, Marilyn tried. She invited them to dinner every other Sunday, even though Jessica always pushed her food around like it was too foreign to eat. She remembered the Thanksgiving Jessica brought her own side dishes, quinoa salad and sugarless pie, and set them right next to Marilyn's collard greens and candied yams like a quiet challenge. David said nothing that night, just offered a sheepish smile as Marilyn swallowed her pride with her food. In truth, Marilyn was tired, not of cooking or cleaning or aging, but of pretending she didn't notice how her presence made Jessica shrink inward, of pretending David still looked at her the way he had when he was a boy clutching her apron. Those days were gone. Now he wore tailored suits, spoke in terms like estate planning and advance directives, and talked about her future like it was a liability to be managed. One morning, not long after her 70th birthday, Marilyn woke to the sound of Jessica's voice in the living room. She wasn't supposed to arrive until noon, but there she was early, chirping instructions on the phone about memory assessments and long-term care options. When Marilyn entered the room, Jessica smiled too brightly and clicked off the call. "Just checking in on some options," she said breezily. "You know, for when the time comes." "What time?" Marilyn asked, but the answer never came. That day, David arrived with her favorite soup, okra and chicken, and a stack of paperwork he said she should just glance over when she got a chance. He called them peace of mind documents. She noticed Jessica never looked her in the eye that entire visit. In the evenings, Marilyn sat alone at the kitchen table, running her hands along the wood grain of the table Thomas had built, wondering how long it would take before her own child made her a stranger in her own house. She wasn't naive. The distance had been creeping in for years, like ivy clawing at the sides of her home, quiet but persistent. Still, she tried to believe that blood meant something. That David remembered who helped him learn to tie his shoes, who stitched every patch on his worn school pants, who waited on buses for 2 hours in the rain just to bring him lunch when he forgot his. She tried to believe her love had been enough. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Marilyn had spent the day scrubbing baseboards. Jessica was coming the next day for lunch, and she always managed to find some invisible spot of dirt to comment on. Marilyn skipped breakfast and lunch, focused entirely on getting every surface spotless. By 3 in the afternoon, her knees ached and her head felt light. She reached for a cloth on the countertop, missed, and collapsed before she could call out. The sound of her fall echoed through the quiet house. When she came to, the lights were too bright, the walls too white, and the scent of antiseptic burned her nose. David was beside her, holding her hand with a strange urgency. Jessica stood behind him, arms crossed, and smiled tight. "You fainted, Mama," David said. "We're just getting you checked out, nothing serious." Marilyn nodded, too dizzy to argue. She let them take her blood pressure, draw blood, check her vitals. She let them feed her sugar water and talk around her like she wasn't there. "We were just saying," Jessica added smoothly, "that maybe it's time to start thinking about simplifying things, just in case." "In case of what?" Marilyn asked. They didn't answer. A few days later, David showed up unannounced and offered to take her to lunch. "Just the 3 of them," he said. "You need a break. Let us spoil you a little." She hesitated, looked at the pile of laundry she'd meant to fold, the leftover stew she'd planned to warm for dinner. But something in his eyes reminded her of the boy he once was, the one who used to fall asleep on her lap during thunderstorms. She nodded, pulled on her good sweater, and stepped out the door without her phone, without her bag, without knowing it would be the last time she'd see her home on her own terms. They drove in silence for most of the ride. Jessica hummed along to the radio. David tapped the steering wheel. When they arrived, Marilyn saw the sign and her stomach dropped. Sunset Hollow Residential Wellness Center. "This isn't a restaurant," she said, but David only smiled. "It's just for a few days," he said, already opening the door for her. "Rest up. The nurse will help you get settled." Jessica kissed her cheek, and the cold press of her lip gloss felt like ice. Then they walked away, leaving her with strangers in uniforms and a room with no photos, no books, no calendar. Just a bed she didn't choose, in a place she didn't belong. And outside, the world went on like nothing had changed. But everything had. She had given her son her life, and in return, he had given her a room to die in. But she wasn't dead. Not yet. And deep inside her, the part that had carried a child through hunger, that had stood in line for food stamps, that had faced down employers who paid her half what she deserved, something ancient and unmovable stirred. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Marilyn sat on the edge of a stiff mattress, her hands folded neatly in her lap like she was waiting for church to begin. But there were no hymnals here, no familiar faces, no warm Sunday smell of fried fish and cornbread drifting from the fellowship hall. only the sterile scent of disinfectant, the dull buzz of fluorescent lighting, and the hollow clack of soft-soled shoes passing by her open door. Outside her window, a small courtyard stood barren save for 2 concrete benches and a dying hibiscus bush that someone had forgotten to water. Somewhere down the hall, someone moaned. Another voice, a man's, barked a name into the silence and then cursed the air. She didn't cry. Not yet. That would come later. A whiteboard hung crookedly on the wall, her name scrawled in blue marker, Marilyn W. Underneath it, the words New Resident, Observation were circled. It was surrounded by faux cheerful clip art, a son wearing sunglasses, a smiling nurse drawn like a cartoon. Marilyn stared at it for a long time, her eyes tracing each letter like they belonged to someone else. She wasn't resident. She wasn't anyone's patient. She hadn't agreed to this. She hadn't packed a bag, hadn't kissed her photographs goodbye. She hadn't said goodbye to her house. She felt naked, stripped not only of her belongings but of something more intimate, her autonomy. When the nurse came in, a young woman with bleached blonde curls and a name tag that read Camille in cursive script, Marilyn asked to call her son. Camille smiled too brightly, as if she were speaking to a small child. "You can use the phone during visiting hours, sweetie. Family time is scheduled, okay?" Marilyn repeated herself, this time sharper. "I said, I want to speak to my son. Now." Camille blinked, taken aback, then adjusted her tone. "He already left, ma'am. He signed all the intake forms. Everything's taken care of. You're safe now." Safe? The word hit her like a slap. "I'm not confused," Marilyn said, her voice low. Camille gave a soft, pitying smile and said nothing. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Marilyn alone again in the beige box of a room. She stood slowly and walked to the mirror above the sink. Her reflection stared back. Same soft eyes, same silver-threaded hair pulled back into a bun, same sturdy frame clothed in the loose sweatshirt Jessica had handed her that morning. Nothing looked different. But everything had changed. She touched her face as if to remind herself she was still real. That evening, a tray of bland food was slid onto her nightstand. Mushy green beans, powdered mashed potatoes, and a slice of meatloaf that smelled faintly metallic. No cornbread, no hot sauce, no salt. Marilyn barely touched it. Her stomach was a knot. She asked again for a phone. The night nurse, an older man with tired eyes, explained that the facility had policies in place to protect residents from confusion and agitation. Family members were advised not to call for the first 72 hours. "Helps with transition," he said. Transition into what? Captivity? The next day, she asked to speak with the administrator. A woman named Miss Kessler finally agreed to see her after lunch. She wore a tight suit and a tighter smile. Her eyes darted to her computer as she spoke. "Your son provided ample documentation," she explained. "We were under the impression you were no longer safe on your own. There's a signed power of attorney, medical clearance for placement, and residential consent forms. All legal. All valid." "I didn't sign anything," Marilyn said. Her voice was calm, cold. "Well, your name is here." Miss Kessler rotated her monitor, showing Marilyn a digital scan of a signature that resembled hers. Barely. "This is you, yes?" Marilyn didn't answer. Her heart thudded in her chest. The signature looked familiar, but the date, 2 weeks ago, was a day she'd spent in her garden planting spring onions. She hadn't signed anything. Not then. Not ever. "This is a mistake," she said. "I understand it's difficult," Miss Kessler said gently, folding her hands. but many residents feel confused or disoriented during intake. Give it some time. Your son has your best interests at heart. That night, Marilyn didn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak and shuffle in the hallway sharpening her sense of isolation. She thought about her house, the way the porch light flickered unless she tapped it just right, the creak in the third floorboard, the tiny ceramic angel on the mantel that David had made in third grade. All of it. Hers, her memories, her life, now stolen, now gone. The next morning, she asked for her personal belongings, her purse, her phone, her wallet. Camille blinked, then left the room. She returned with a brown plastic bag containing only the clothes Marilyn had arrived in and a few coins. No phone, no ID. They said you wouldn't need anything right away, Camille chirped. Jessica said she'd bring you some things next week. Jessica, of course. Marilyn nearly laughed. Later that afternoon, as she sat in the facility's common room, a garish lounge with forced smiles on every wall and a flat-screen TV playing a cooking show no one watched, she overheard a staff member say, "That's the new one. Her family said she's been slipping. Possible dementia." Dementia. The word curdled in her gut. She turned her head and caught the staff member's eyes. The young woman blushed, then walked away. By the end of the day, Marilyn felt like a ghost. She spoke, and people pretended not to hear. She asked, and people delayed. She protested, and they smiled as if she were a child having a tantrum. Somewhere, deep in her soul, something began to crack. Not from weakness, from betrayal. 3 days. That's how long she waited. On the 4th day, she finally gained access to the community phone. The receptionist dialed the number for her and handed over the receiver. Marilyn held it to her ear, heart pounding. Straight to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. Then she called Jessica's number. 1 ring. Then a recorded voice. "This caller has blocked you." Marilyn stared at the phone for a long time before slowly setting it down. That night, she sat in her room, lights off, curtain pulled back just enough to see the fading sky. She watched the moon rise over the roof of the facility, pale and distant. In the courtyard below, 2 residents sat in wheelchairs, unmoving, their eyes glazed with time. One of them wept quietly. The other stared into nothing. And Marilyn thought, is this where I end, after everything I gave, after everything I held back to make sure my child could reach further than I ever could? No. Her voice in her head was firm, steel. No. That night, she asked the night nurse for a pen and a notebook. "I like to journal," she said sweetly. The nurse, a gentle Haitian woman named Clarice, smiled and brought her a small spiral-bound notebook from the activities room, along with a blue pen. Marilyn didn't write prayers. She didn't write poems. She wrote facts. She wrote names, dates, transaction histories, property details, the name of her old lawyer, Hope Carmichael, who had helped her navigate the insurance claim after Thomas died. A woman who, as far as Marilyn knew, was still practicing. She wrote down her bank's routing number, her house's parcel ID. The last 4 digits of the joint account David had once used to help her pay utilities, the one she had never removed his name from. She wrote in silence, her hand steady, her jaw tight. They thought she wouldn't notice when her name disappeared from the electric bill. They thought she wouldn't realize the automatic deposit from her pension had been rerouted. They thought that just because she was 70, black, and wore orthopedic shoes, she wouldn't fight. But Marilyn had survived more than this. She'd survived the long walk home from segregated schools. She'd survived food lines, eviction notices, and an employer who once locked her in a closet as a joke. She had survived a husband's cancer, a miscarriage, and the long ache of being alone. And she would survive this too, but not quietly. She turned the page and wrote at the top, Phase 1. She circled it, drew a line under it. Then she picked up the receiver the next morning and made the call that would start the reckoning. She left a voicemail that would change everything. Hope, this is Marilyn Wright. My son has committed fraud in my name and placed me in a facility against my will. I still have access to the joint account, and I have all my records. Call me. Then she hung up, closed the notebook, and waited. Not as a victim, but as a woman preparing for war. The voicemail was only 26 seconds long, but it rang like thunder through Hope Carmichael's office. She'd been working late that evening, her desk a clutter of half-read files and unreadable handwriting, when the message played through her speaker. She sat still for a full minute after it ended, her pen frozen mid-air. The voice was older now, thinner around the edges, but unmistakable. Marilyn Wright. The woman who once marched into her office with a stack of handwritten notes and a stubborn glint in her eye, demanding to be shown how to write her own will so she wouldn't be cheated out of her husband's life insurance. That same woman, now claiming fraud and forced institutionalization. Hope didn't wait until morning. She called the number back at once. It didn't go through. The facility's front desk clerk, polite but rigid, told her the phones were only for scheduled family communication. Hope's tone cooled to legal steel. I'm her attorney, and I'm coming tomorrow. When Marilyn was called to the nurse's station the next afternoon, she knew. Something had shifted in the air. The administrator, Miss Kessler, met her in the hallway with a tight-lipped smile, trying to mask the discomfort of someone who knew the floor beneath them was cracking. Your guest is here, she said, as if swallowing stones. Hope stood in the visitor's lounge like a lighthouse, tall, composed, and unflinching. She wore a navy blue blazer, and her hair, once in youthful curls, was pinned into a clean, practical bun. In one hand she held a manila folder, in the other her phone. Her eyes scanned Marilyn from head to toe as she approached, not in pity, but in deep, quiet fury. Are you safe? She asked. As safe as a woman can be, Marilyn replied, when her own child signs her away like a set of dishes. Hope exhaled slowly. Tell me everything. They sat side by side in the corner of the lounge, far from the television playing reruns of a game show no one was watching. Marilyn opened her notebook, each page filled with methodical handwriting. She went line by line, detailing what had been done. The forged signatures, the sudden change in power of attorney, the freeze on her account, the removal of her name from utility bills. She listed all the belongings she hadn't been allowed to pack, including family heirlooms, a wedding quilt, and her late husband's military flag. Hope listened, expressionless, only nodding. When Marilyn paused, Hope opened the manila folder and took out her own copy of the property deed. Marilyn's name was still there, sole owner, no secondary signature, no co-owner clause. They couldn't change the deed, Hope said. They never had legal standing to do it. It's still yours. Marilyn nodded once. Then I want to go biblical. Hope arched a brow. I don't want just legal, Marilyn said. I want justice that leaves a mark. Hope smiled faintly, but her eyes stayed sharp. Then we start with revocation. You're competent. That's our weapon. We'll file for emergency annulment of the power of attorney and submit for full reinstatement of your legal rights. I'll need a cognitive evaluation from a licensed doctor. preferably this facility's own. Marilyn smirked. The night nurse said I remember more birthdays than she does. That'll help, Hope said, standing. We'll need that on record. You won't stay here another week. Over the next 48 hours, the storm took shape. Hope filed an emergency motion in district court to revoke the power of attorney, citing fraudulent consent and elder exploitation. She attached Marilyn's handwritten documentation, the original property deed, and a medical report signed by the facility's physician stating Marilyn showed no signs of cognitive decline. The staff became nervous, visibly so. Miss Kessler stopped making eye contact. Camille called Marilyn ma'am instead of sweetie. By Wednesday, the court approved the emergency petition. Marilyn was officially recognized as a mentally competent adult with full legal rights restored. The next morning, Hope arrived with 2 large suitcases and a look that dared anyone to object. Marilyn walked out of the facility in clean clothes and new shoes, carrying her notebook like scripture. No one stopped her. No one said goodbye. The doors closed behind her with the hush of finality. They didn't go home. Not yet. Hope had rented a suite at a nearby extended stay hotel, a quiet place with a kitchenette and a garden courtyard. Marilyn stood at the window, looking out at the trimmed hedges and sunlight pooling on the patio furniture. She could still smell antiseptic in her memory, but outside the air was clean. "David doesn't know you're out," Hope said as she unpacked. "That's to our advantage." "He will," Marilyn said softly, her eyes narrowing. "He will soon enough." That weekend, they went to work. Hope reopened the joint account David had assumed was closed. She froze all transactions linked to his mortgage, his car payment, and any credit lines tied to Marilyn's name. She filed notices with the local utility companies, reestablishing Marilyn's name and revoking David's authority to manage any accounts. She even alerted the IRS of a possible identity misuse, just in case. Then they filed a petition for a court-enforced partition sale of Marilyn's home. Because David wasn't an owner. Because he had no right to be there. And if he refused to leave, law enforcement would be authorized to remove him. On Tuesday morning, the private process server arrived at Marilyn's former address at exactly 7 a.m. According to his report, Jessica answered the door in a satin robe, her hair twisted on top of her head in a messy bun. She screamed. David appeared behind her, pale as death. He slammed the door before the server could even finish the sentence. That evening, Marilyn's hotel phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. She let it buzz once, twice. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Mom?" David's voice was tight, almost childlike. "We got something in the mail today. Is this real?" Marilyn didn't answer. "You can't be serious," he said. "You're going to kick me out of my own house?" "You mean the house you threw me out of?" Her voice was calm. I never meant for... You forged my name. You froze my accounts. You took my life while I was still living it." There was a long pause. Jessica thought. "I don't care what Jessica thought," Marilyn said. "You're the one I raised, and you let her put me in a box before I was even buried." Another silence, a different kind. "You're really going through with this?" "Yes," she said. "You have 30 days to leave." She hung up before he could respond. That night, she slept with the windows open and the television off. The air smelled like gardenias from the courtyard bush, and for the first time in weeks, her dreams were not about locked doors or white walls. They were of home and breath and freedom. Hope came by the next morning with coffee and a fresh batch of legal notices. "Ready for the next step?" Marilyn smiled, eyes bright. "I've been waiting for this one." She turned back to the window, watching the sun lift over the rooftops like a promise. David thought she was gone. Jessica thought she was silenced. But they forgot who they were dealing with. They forgot the kind of woman who builds her house with her own hands. They forgot that you don't bury a woman like Marilyn Wright. You plant her, and she grows back stronger. The last time Marilyn Wright stood in front of her old house, the one she had fought for, sacrificed for, and scrubbed clean with hands that bled, it no longer felt like home. The porch that once held potted mums in the fall now bore nothing but the weight of arrogance. The curtains had changed. Jessica's taste, no doubt, and even the smell was different. Something synthetic that clashed with the memory of fresh-baked sweet rolls and lemon oil polish. But this wasn't a return. This was reconnaissance. Hope parked the car across the street under the shade of a jacaranda tree and handed Marilyn a folder with a real estate listing tucked inside. The headline read, "Charming three-bedroom craftsman with mature garden, across from local park." The park, of course, was only a name. It was just a circle of grass with 2 benches and a broken swing. But the location, that was what mattered. The house was directly across the street from her old one, close enough to see David's porch, his mailbox, the very steps he had stood on when he lied to her face. "I can buy this?" Marilyn asked, flipping through the listing. "You can," Hope replied. "All cash, no mortgage, quick close." Marilyn turned back to the window. David hadn't come out since the papers had been served. The house looked quiet, stunned. Jessica's car hadn't moved. The blinds were drawn like a fortress. There were no garden parties now, no jazz spilling onto the lawn, no scented candles wafting from open windows. Just silence. "I want it," Marilyn said. "I want that house." It took 3 days. Hope filed the purchase, paid the full amount from the unfrozen account, and secured the deed in Marilyn's name. The seller, a retired couple moving to Florida, was eager to be done with the whole thing. They never asked why an elderly woman wanted to live across from a man who hadn't spoken to her since he signed her away. It wasn't their business. Marilyn moved in on a Sunday. The first thing she did was sit on the front steps in her best Sunday hat, holding a cup of sweet tea in a porcelain mug with a small chip in the rim. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just sat, still and solid, as the wind whispered through the trees like gossip. She didn't have to wait long. David came out mid-morning, wearing gym shorts and a wrinkled t-shirt. He was taking out the trash, phone pressed to his ear. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in days. He stopped in his tracks the moment he saw her. Marilyn watched his face change, confusion first, then disbelief, then something close to panic. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He turned around, trash still in hand, and walked back inside. Marilyn sipped her tea. For 4 days, she didn't see Jessica at all. The car was there, but the curtains never moved. On the 5th day, Jessica pulled out of the driveway quickly, face stiff, and parked on the opposite side of the street. She didn't look in Marilyn's direction, didn't acknowledge her presence. But her body language screamed everything. Her shoulders were rigid, her jaw clenched. She walked into the house like the air outside was poisonous. That same afternoon, Marilyn went to the hardware store and bought 6 rose bushes, deep red, full bloom, with thorns like miniature spears. She planted them along the fence separating her new yard from the street. Every thorn a memory. Every bloom a testament. The neighbors, at first, said nothing, but she saw the blinds move. The older woman 2 doors down, who used to wave during morning walks, now watched silently from her window. A man jogging past slowed every time he passed Marilyn's house, his head turning just slightly. The neighborhood, like any other, thrived on stories, and this one had all the makings of legend. At night, Marilyn sat in her living room and watched television with the volume low. Occasionally, she saw David pass behind his curtains, just the silhouette, sometimes holding a drink, sometimes pacing. Once, she saw him sitting on the floor, back against the wall, head in his hands. She didn't feel pity. She felt truth. The truth of what it meant to be erased and then to reappear, not as a shadow, but as a presence. Tyler was the first to cross the boundary. He came walking down the sidewalk after school one Thursday afternoon, backpack slung low, his sneakers scuffed and loose. He paused at the edge of her lawn, looked at the roses, then at the house, then back at the house he had just left. He hesitated. Then he stepped onto her path and knocked on the door. Marilyn opened it slowly. She said nothing. "Can I sit with you a while?" Tyler asked, not meeting her eyes. She stepped aside. They sat on the porch together, side by side. She poured him iced tea and handed him a plate of ginger cookies. He didn't speak for a long time, just ate and watched the cars pass by. "They told me you had dementia," he said finally. "Said you weren't safe alone." Marilyn looked at him, her face unreadable. "You don't look confused to me." She smiled faintly. "I never was." He nodded, ashamed. "Why'd you buy the house next door?" "Because your father needed a reminder," she said, "one he could see from his front porch every day." Tyler let out a breath, half laugh, half gasp. "You're colder than I thought, Grandma." "No," she replied. "I'm just finished pretending I owe anyone my silence." He stayed for dinner. She made red beans and rice with cornbread on the side. He ate like he hadn't tasted real food in weeks. Afterward, they looked through photo albums. He asked about the man in uniform, Thomas, his grandfather, and Marilyn told him stories David had never bothered to pass down. Tyler listened, eyes wide, nodding slowly as the past unspooled before him like ribbon. He didn't go back home that night. She made up the guest room, fluffed the pillows, and left the nightlight on in the hallway. David didn't come looking. Jessica didn't call. By the weekend, Tyler had come again, and again. He said the quiet helped him think. Said he was tired of the tension. He started staying for full weekends, helped in the garden, asked about recipes, talked about school, about his friends, about his dreams. He never mentioned his parents unless prompted. Marilyn never prompted. The roses bloomed thicker each week, their scent wrapping around the porch like armor. The neighborhood kept watching, but no one dared knock. Jessica returned to her parties. At first, small gatherings, then larger ones. Wine nights on the back patio with music just loud enough to carry over the fence. Laughter that felt forced. Statements like, "She's obviously obsessed with us," tossed into the air with a casual malice. Marilyn didn't respond. She didn't need to. Happy people didn't announce their happiness to the whole street. They simply lived it. Then, on a Sunday morning, Marilyn watched from her window as a crooked "For Sale" sign appeared in David's front yard. Tyler came downstairs later, holding a muffin in one hand. "They're selling?" "I guess," he said. "She wants to go back to Texas." He doesn't want to leave, but he doesn't want to stay either. "Why not?" "Because every time he looks outside, he sees you." Marilyn said nothing, just reached over and gently patted his hand. That night, she opened her old notebook, the one she had started in the facility, the one where she had plotted every step, every name, every number. She turned to the last page and wrote a single line. "They thought they buried me." They didn't know I was a seed. Then she closed it, tucked it into the drawer by her bed, and turned off the light. The street outside was quiet, the house across the way was dark, and the roses on her fence glowed deep red in the moonlight, watchful, patient, and impossibly alive. The house stood quiet for 3 more weeks, its windows drawn like eyelids in deep sleep, its porch vacant, and the air around it heavy with a silence that had long outlasted denial. The once vibrant hum of music and laughter that Jessica had filled the evenings with had faded to nothing but a ghost of static in Marilyn's memory. The house she once called home, the house she had built with toil and love, now belonged to neither of them, at least not in spirit. She had given it up, not in defeat, but in defiance, and in its place she had planted herself across the street like a tree whose roots reached deeper than her son's guilt could ever go. David had not spoken to her since the day he asked, "Is this real?" And she answered with the truth. Jessica had vanished not long after the for sale sign went up, her car stuffed with boxes and her jaw set like stone. She had not glanced back, not at David, not at Marilyn. Just pressed her foot on the gas and disappeared like a passing storm, leaving a trail of debris only silence could clean up. Marilyn watched it all unfold from the comfort of her porch, cup of tea in hand, hat casting a long shadow over her brow. She didn't gloat, she didn't cry. She simply observed, the same way the sky watches a fire burn itself out. And when the sign came down and no moving truck arrived, she understood. The house had not sold. Jessica had left alone. David had stayed. The weight of that choice settled on his shoulders like wet wool. He was still there, but not really living. Marilyn saw it in the way his porch light remained off at dusk, how his trash bin stood uncollected until the stench betrayed him, how his lawn had grown just enough to hint at neglect. He sat out front sometimes, late at night, beer bottle in hand, staring into the darkness like it owed him answers. But he never looked across the street. He didn't have to. He knew she was there. That knowledge was louder than any words she could ever say. Tyler, on the other hand, had practically moved in. He came after school every day, his backpack flopping against his spine as he walked down the sidewalk with a rhythm that had become second nature to Marilyn. He stayed for dinner, helped with the dishes, asked questions about herbs and spices, history and heartbreak. He was gentle in the way boys are when they've been forced to grow up around too many adults who forgot how to love without conditions. He never spoke poorly of his parents, but he didn't defend them either. He simply existed in the quiet sanctuary of his grandmother's house, learning what peace felt like for the first time. One evening, as they planted new marigolds along the front path, he asked if they could grow tomatoes next. "Of course," Marilyn said, "we can grow whatever we want." The look on his face, part hope, part disbelief, told her that no one had ever said that to him and meant it. She let him paint a birdhouse to hang on the porch. He chose bright colors, blue, yellow, green, and decorated the roof with little hand-painted vines. It looked out of place next to her antique planters and wrought iron railing, but she left it there anyway. Let it be seen. Let it be his. David watched from his window. She knew he did, not every day, but often enough. He saw Tyler laughing, eating, raking leaves, sitting on the steps with a book in hand. And he saw Marilyn, still standing, still whole, still hers. One morning, a certified letter arrived. It was from Hope. Inside was a final draft of Marilyn's new will, neatly written and fully notarized. The house she now lived in would pass to Tyler when he turned 21. Until then, a trust fund would cover his education, living expenses, and anything else he needed to find his way in the world. The rest of her estate, retirement savings, sale profits, old insurance funds, would go into a community initiative she had quietly begun funding, the Mayfield Legacy Grant, designed to help older women in crisis who had been abandoned or exploited by their families. She signed the documents with a steady hand and sealed them without ceremony. There was no need for drama. The words were enough. The law was enough. She didn't tell David, but he found out. 2 months later, he contacted Hope's office under the pretense of reviewing estate arrangements. Hope, always professional, informed him, politely, firmly, that he had not been included. That night, he called her. "Mom," he said, his voice tight, "is this real?" "Yes," she answered. "You're cutting me out completely?" "No," she said. "You did that all by yourself." There was a pause. "I said I was sorry." "I heard you," she said, "and I forgave you. But forgiveness doesn't mean inheritance." He didn't call again. A month later, the house went dark for a full day. No lights, no car movement, no sound. Marilyn wondered if he had left at last. The next morning, the "For Sale" sign was back, but this time clean, centered, and flanked by a realtor's logo. It stayed for 2 weeks before it, too, vanished. The neighbors said he left town. Some whispered he'd gone to Florida. Others said he'd moved in with college friends. Marilyn didn't ask. She didn't care. The morning after he left, she sat on her porch with a cup of jasmine tea and looked out over the quiet street. Tyler came outside carrying 2 muffins and a notebook. "He's gone," he said, sitting beside her. She nodded. Sometimes people leave when they realize they can't control the story anymore. "You think he'll come back?" "Maybe," she said, "but if he does, he'll find a fence that wasn't there before." Later that day, she began her new routine. Morning tea, porch sweeping, tending the roses. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. That week, she dropped off a check at the community center. $10,000 for the new senior outreach program. No name attached, just an envelope. Tyler came with her, helped carry groceries for the pantry, and smiled at the older women who thanked them both with eyes that had seen too many goodbyes. "Why don't you put your name on it?" he asked. "Because the people who need it don't care who gave it," she said. "They just need to know someone did." The following Sunday, the center called. They were hosting an elder justice seminar and asked if Marilyn would speak about financial abuse and reclaiming legal rights. At first, she declined, but that evening, she stood in her hallway and looked at a photo of Thomas in his uniform. He had always said she had a voice that could move mountains, but she had spent most of her life whispering. Maybe it was time to speak. She accepted. On the day of the seminar, she wore a dark purple suit and a silver pin Tyler had found at a flea market and cleaned until it shone. She stood before a room full of women, most over 60, most in quiet clothes and tired shoes, and told her story. Not the revenge, not the pain, but the truth, the power of the law, the weight of silence, the strength of choosing to begin again. They clapped, some wept. One woman hugged her hard and whispered, "Thank you for reminding me I'm not crazy." And just like that, Marilyn became more than a name on a mailbox. She became a reminder, a voice, a seed that grew back, not in spite of the storm, but because of it. Back at home, Tyler made dinner. He had learned to season his greens. He had learned to watch the cornbread without burning it. He had learned to ask about the past without fearing the answers. They ate on the porch, the birdhouse swinging gently in the breeze. Across the street, the house stood empty. just a shadow, just a lesson, just a warning. By the time the dogwood trees bloomed again and the air turned thick with the scent of cut grass and spring rain, the house across the street had taken on the look of something abandoned not by force, but by shame. The once pristine hedges Jessica had manicured so carefully had grown wild, branches curling over the walkway like accusing fingers. The windows remained shuttered. The lights stayed off, even at dusk. Dust clung to the corners of the porch, and the mailbox hung open some days, as if no one inside cared whether the world still remembered them. Marilyn noticed these things the way a gardener notices the slow yellowing of leaves, the subtle signs of decay that come not from sudden sickness, but from prolonged neglect. She didn't need to cross the street. She had already done what needed doing. The rest would fall as it must. Tyler had settled fully into her home by now. The boy who once hesitated at her fence now called it our house without thinking. His school books lined the coffee table. His shoes sat by the door. His laughter filled the kitchen as they cooked meals together, playing old records while they chopped onions and stirred pots of gumbo. He had taken to reading her the headlines from the newspaper in the mornings and asking questions about everything: history, music, her childhood in Alabama, the years before David was born. He asked about David less and less, but when he did, it was never bitter. It was the curiosity of someone trying to understand a story he'd only been told from one side. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the last of the light drain from the sky, he asked, "Do you think he's still angry?" Marilyn considered the question for a moment. "I think he's more lost than angry. Do you think he regrets it?" She took a slow sip of tea. Regret and guilt are not the same thing. One makes you change. The other just makes you quiet. Tyler nodded, understanding more than she expected for a boy of 14. The next day, the knock came. It was late afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the porch. Marilyn was folding laundry by the window when she heard it. 3 hesitant raps. Not urgent, not demanding, but unmistakably familiar. She opened the door. David stood on her porch, hat in hand, his posture uncertain, like a child waiting to be scolded. He wore a button-down shirt tucked into jeans that looked a size too loose. His face was gaunt, not from hunger, but from something deeper, regret maybe, or exhaustion that sleep could not cure. "Why are you doing this?" he asked after a long silence. Marilyn didn't invite him in. She stepped outside and let the screen door click shut behind her. "Doing what?" "Living here, across the street, watching us. I bought this house," she said, "because I like the view." "You're trying to humiliate me." "No," she said, "that part already happened. When you called me a burden, when you signed me away and pretended I wouldn't fight." David looked down at the wooden floorboards beneath his shoes. "I didn't know how to help. Jessica, she said you were slipping, that you weren't safe. You didn't ask me." "I got scared," he admitted, barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to lose everything trying to take care of you." Marilyn's voice was quiet but sharp. "You didn't take care of me. You got rid of me." He flinched. "I was wrong," he said. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than any apology could carry. She waited, eyes steady, until he looked back up at her. "I don't expect anything," he continued. "I just wanted to say it." Marilyn took a slow breath. Her hands, though still and calm, twitched slightly at her sides. "You thought you could bury me, David," she said, "but you forgot what I had left in me. You forgot what I gave up to raise you, what I endured to keep that house, to keep the lights on, To make sure you had shoes on your feet when I didn't have any on mine?" He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't forget," he whispered. I tried to rewrite the ending." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, gently, she added, "Tyler is safe with me. He can stay as long as he needs. But you've got some soul-searching to do, and you won't do it on this porch." She turned and walked back to the door, letting it close behind her without slamming it. Inside, the house smelled of lemon polish and cornbread. The radio played a jazz station low enough to sound like memory. Tyler was sitting at the kitchen table, notebook open, pencil in hand. "Was that him?" he asked without looking up. Marilyn nodded. "What did he say?" "Nothing I haven't already heard in my heart," she said. Tyler closed the notebook and looked at her. "I'm glad you're my grandma." She smiled, the kind that lives behind the eyes. "Me too, baby, me too." That night, they had sweet potato pie for dessert. After Tyler went to bed, Marilyn sat by the window and looked out at the house across the street. The porch light was on, but no one sat beneath it. No music played, no voices rose. It wasn't her burden anymore. The next morning, she woke early and walked out to the garden. The tomatoes were sprouting now, small green bulbs promising something ripe. She touched one gently, the way she used to touch David's forehead when he was sick. The warmth of the sun soaked into her palms. She had once believed peace would come with reconciliation, but standing there, surrounded by new life and growing things, she understood something truer. Peace didn't come from being welcome back. It came from never needing to return. A week passed, then another. David didn't knock again. Instead, one morning, a moving truck pulled into the driveway across the street. Two men in uniforms loaded furniture, boxes, suitcases. There was no U-Haul logo, no spectacle, just quiet efficiency. David stood on the porch for a long while before he stepped down and got into a car that looked like it hadn't been driven in months. He didn't look toward Marilyn's house. He didn't wave. The truck pulled away slowly, and that was it. No goodbyes, no letters, no calls. Just silence, final and clean. Later that evening, Tyler came home from school with a small paper in his hand. It was a flyer for a school gardening club. "I want to join," he said. "They're doing tomatoes and squash and some herbs." Marilyn took the flyer, smiled at the bright colors, the misspelled words, the enthusiasm only teenagers could infuse into something so simple. "Of course," she said, "we can grow whatever we want." She meant it, in every way. That night, as the porch light glowed soft behind them and the cicadas sang their slow lullaby, Marilyn sat in her chair and looked across the street at the now empty house. It stood hollow, lifeless, just boards and paint and echoes. A shell. She didn't feel victorious. She felt clean. Sometimes that was enough, and as the stars emerged overhead and the scent of rosemary and warm earth curled through the air, she thought maybe the real justice was not in what you took back, but in what you chose to never carry again. The days moved more gently after David left. There was no dramatic closure, no final scene, no confrontation on the porch with words meant to wound or reconcile. He was simply gone, folded into the past like a page in a book that no longer needed to be read. His absence was not a hole, but a relief, like finally exhaling after holding your breath for far too long. Marilyn noticed the quiet first. The house across the street no longer buzzed with tension or resentment. No shadows moved behind the curtains. The porch stayed empty. Even the weeds that curled along the walkway seemed to pause in their slow conquest, waiting for something that would not return. And in the place of that old noise, Her own life unfolded, not with fanfare, but with something richer: certainty. Tyler thrived in this new silence. He rose early for school without prompting, packed his own lunches, asked about bus schedules and reading lists. He joined the gardening club and brought home soil under his nails and stories about irrigation systems and composting. He helped plant a row of cherry tomatoes in their side yard, carefully measuring the space between each seedling, checking sun exposure, asking questions about root depth and fertilizer. When he spoke now, it was with the tone of someone who knew he was being listened to. He stopped asking about his father. Marilyn didn't press him. Some things did not need to be pulled apart to be understood. Instead, she gave him room to laugh, to build, to remember on his own terms. She taught him how to cook red beans and rice, how to make biscuits so soft they broke in your hands, how to clean a fish without wasting the bones. She shared family recipes not written in any book, told stories about her childhood in Montgomery, about her mother who once fought for the right to vote, and her brother who built radios from scratch in a garage that smelled of sawdust and ambition. He asked questions David never had. Real questions. Not just about the food or the names in the photos, but about the people behind them. What made them angry? What made them laugh? What they sacrificed? What they stood for? "You remember everything," he said one evening, flipping through an old family album. "I had to," she replied. "If I didn't, who would?" One Friday afternoon, Marilyn took him with her to the local church pantry. They brought boxes of canned goods, bags of rice, and bottles of oil. A few older women recognized her and pulled her aside quietly. "We heard what they did to you, Miss Marilyn," one said. "We're sorry." Marilyn smiled, soft but unwavering. "God restores what people try to ruin." They nodded, their eyes filled with a silent kind of reverence. She could see they had watched everything from afar. The whole neighborhood had. It was never the shouted stories that spread the furthest. It was the quiet ones. The ones whispered over fences and shared in glances across porches. David's silence had rung louder than his defense ever could have. Later that weekend, she and Tyler dropped off another donation at the community center, this time a check for $50,000. She had never written a check with that many zeros before. She didn't put her name on it. She left it anonymous, tucked into a manila envelope with only a note that read, "For the ones who have been forgotten." Tyler asked, "Why not let them know it's from you?" "Because it's not about me," she said. "The people who need it don't care who gave it. They just need to know someone did." That Sunday morning, she was baking sweet potato pie when she heard the knock. It was soft, tentative. She wiped her hands on a towel, walked to the door, and opened it. David stood there. He looked thinner than before. His hair needed cutting. His eyes were red, though he wasn't crying. "I wanted to talk," he said. She stepped onto the porch, but didn't open the screen for him. "Danielle's not coming back," he began. "I tried to fix things, but everything fell apart." She said nothing. "I messed up, Mama." The words came out like bricks, heavy, uneven. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I got scared. I didn't want to lose everything trying to take care of you." "You didn't take care of me," she said. "You got rid of me." He looked down, his voice cracking. "I was wrong." She waited, not out of cruelty, out of principle. She had learned not to rescue people from their own realizations. "I just wanted to say it," he finished. Marilyn took a breath, deep and steady. "Tyler is safe with me. He can stay as long as he needs." David nodded, ashamed. But you, she continued, you've got work to do, and you won't do it on this porch. She turned and walked back inside. She didn't slam the door. She didn't cry. She let the smell of sweet potato and cinnamon fill the air as she set the table for two. A few minutes later, Tyler came down the stairs. "Was that him?" he asked. She nodded. "What did he say?" "Nothing I hadn't already heard in my heart," she said, "but it's not my job to carry him anymore." He sat at the table, smiling at the pie. "I'm glad you're my grandma." She reached over, touched his hand. "Me too, baby. Me too." Outside, David sat on his porch alone again, and Marilyn let him. Because peace, once reclaimed, is not something you surrender again. Weeks passed. The house across the street remained empty. The lawn overgrew again. Flyers hung loosely from the mailbox. No lights, no visitors. Tyler split his time between school, the garden, and helping Marilyn at the center. He started tutoring a younger student who was struggling in math. He talked about maybe becoming a teacher one day. Marilyn encouraged it. She saw in him something David had lost, not brilliance but balance, a sense of self not built on image or expectation, but on service. Then, one morning, a certified letter arrived. It was from Hope. Inside was a final copy of the will, stamped and sealed. Everything was official now. Tyler's name stood bold and alone where David's used to be. The house was his when he came of age. Until then, the trust would protect him. The community fund, the Mayfield Legacy Grant, was live. Applications were already coming in. Marilyn placed the letter in her lockbox and sipped her tea. She thought of the women who would now be seen, heard, helped. Women who had poured themselves into children and husbands and had been discarded the moment their backs bent or their hair turned silver. She had lived that story. Now she was rewriting the ending. 2 months later, Hope called to say David had reached out again. He'd asked for a copy of the estate plan. Hope told him, politely, without malice, that he wasn't included. That night, David called. "This is real?" he asked. "Yes." "You're cutting me out completely?" "No," she said, "you did that all by yourself." He was silent. "You didn't just fail me, David. You erased me, and now you're learning what that feels like. I said I was sorry. I heard you, and I forgave you, but forgiveness doesn't mean inheritance." She hung up. That was the last time she spoke to him. A month later, he moved quietly. No U-Haul, no goodbye. The for sale sign returned briefly, then vanished. The neighbors said he went south. Marilyn didn't ask where. The day he left, she sat on her porch with jasmine tea and a slice of pie. Tyler came out carrying 2 muffins. "He's gone," he said. She nodded. Sometimes people leave when they realize they can't control the story anymore. "You think he'll try to come back?" "Maybe," she said. "But if he does, he'll find a fence that wasn't there before." Later that spring, she was invited to speak at a regional conference for elder justice. She stood before a hall of strangers and told them everything. The manipulation, the forged documents, the erasure, the silence, the return. She didn't cry. She didn't perform. She told the truth plainly, and it landed like stone in water, sending ripples out to places she couldn't see. Afterward, a woman approached her in tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for reminding me I'm not crazy." Marilyn smiled and held her hand. "You're not invisible either." When she returned home that evening, Tyler had made dinner, macaroni and baked chicken, slightly dry but full of effort. They ate by candlelight. The roses along the fence glowed red in the moonlight. "I've been thinking about college," Tyler said. "I want to stay close. Maybe go into social work." "You'd be good at that," Marilyn said. I just want to help people like you helped me." She didn't reply. She just reached over, touched his cheek, and let the silence speak for them both. Later that night, when the dishes were done and the porch swept clean, Marilyn opened the notebook from the nursing home one last time. She turned to the back page where she had written, "They thought they buried me. They didn't know I was a seed." She smiled and closed it. She wasn't at the end of anything. She was just beginning. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video for another powerful journey, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.